I welcome you all to the lecture number 4 of this course titled Psychology of Personality and Individual Differences. So, we are in the module 2 and we have already covered one lecture under module 2. Today is the second lecture of the module 2 and overall it is fourth lecture of the course. So, today we will be talking about specific methods of personality assessment. In the last lecture, which we will be just talking about some brief recap of last lecture. In the last lecture, we talked more about the introduction of the personality assessment, where we talked about that what are the characteristics of a good test, personality test, because there are many personality tests which are floating around. Most of them may not be a good test. So, how do you identify a good test? So, in that context, we have discussed the characteristics of a good test. More specifically, we discussed three important characteristics. One is reliability, validity and generalizability. We also discussed the various ethical issues that are associated with personality assessment, because in the personality assessment has a lot of practical implications. This test could be used for diverse applied context. For example, this test could be used for recruitments in jobs as well as let us say in the defense sectors, or maybe for the admissions in schools and so on. So, since these tests have very specific a lot of very important applied implications in different real life context. So, there is a need for ethical use of such test, because the misleading test can lead to misleading results and which can then bias certain kinds of individuals and so on. We also discussed three major sources of biases in personality tests, which include gender bias, response bias and ethnic biases. So, we have discussed all these things in the last class. Today, we will be talking more about the specific kinds of tests, which are categories of tests which are used in the personality assessment. So, more specifically, we will be talking about self-report test, Q-SWOT tests, projective tests, clinical interviews and physiological measures which are used in the personality assessment. So, when we talk about personality assessment methods, there are diverse ways to look at it. We have different theories of personalities, which we will be kind of looking at as we kind of proceed in this course, and most of these theories have their own ways of kind of assessing personalities, and those assessment of personalities kinds of became a backbone for the knowledge for the data for their theories. So, there can be the method can vary in different types of in terms of objectivity, in terms of reliability, in terms of validity. Some tests may include dream interpretation, childhood recollections, computer administered objective test and so on. So, there are diverse ways of measuring personality, methods of personality assessment, and all these methods may vary in their kind of scientific rigors and all the concepts of reliability and validity. Most of these theories base their or kind of collect the data using those kind of assessment methods, and they become backbone of their theories. Now, when we talked about diverse ways of measuring personality, in that context Robbins and his colleagues did a kind of research with about 72 personality psychologists, and they asked them what kind of test they use. They gave a list of tests and they asked to what extent they use this kind of test. So, this kind of the result of this study shows the varied nature of personality assessment tests which are available. So, if you see self-report scales and questionnaires were used by all personality psychologists, then it is followed by, in the decreasing order of percentage, judgment of self and others. About 99% of psychologists said they use this kind of tests. About 89% says they use behavioral observation. About 86% said they use informants reports. Behavioral responses were studied by about 81%. The other judgment tasks that are used using certain stimuli, about 79%. Structured interviews were used by 76% of psychologists. Narrative open-ended questionnaires, about 74% of them used, and the list actually goes on. So, about 65% say they use experience sampling method, which we discussed in the second lecture, in the research method, that there is a kind of experience sampling method which kind of directly tries to collect data on the real time basis. So, participants are given certain beep instruments, and whenever that beep sound comes up, they are supposed to record what is happening in their whatever based on the objective of the study. They need to kind of record what is happening in terms of behavior or in terms of thought processes, whatever it is. So, it is more like a real time measurement of data. Certain implicit measures, there are different kinds of implicit measures that also are used by about 64%, memory tasks, reaction time, and if you see most of these others are about physiological measures, which are relatively less number of people have used them, simply because as we have already kind of discussed that physiological measures, measuring them are kind of more expensive, and it takes more time and more expertise, more specialized training is required for this kind of test. So, maybe most of not many people uses them. So, this list shows the diverse kind of personality assessment methods used by psychologists to assess personality. So, if you see broadly all these kinds of tests, psychologists kinds of agree that broadly they can be categorized under two major categories. One is self-report test and performance based test. So, self-report tests are also called as objective tests, performance based tests are also loosely called as projective tests. So, this is a kind of making it more simpler way of categorizing. Most of the tests could be categorized either one of these tests. Some tests may fall outside of them also little bit, but most of the test comes under this. So, let us kind of discuss some of the more popular methods of personality assessments. We will not be able to talk about all kinds of tests, but some of the major assessment methods will be discussed here. So, the first one is the most popular, most commonly used is self-report test, personality test, and these are, as we have seen in the last the research report or the data show, almost everybody 100% of personality psychologists use this kind of test. So, it is one of the most common personality tests, and it depends on test taker self reports. So, the participants are asked about certain questions about themselves and they report about themselves. So, it is kind of self reported information by the person himself or herself. So, this self report personality measures may use the diverse kind of formats, it may be dichotomous two choice scale. So, the scale may be in the structure could be dichotomous, like it may use questions based on true false type or yes no type of question. So, a question is asked and you are supposed to say whether this statement is true or false for in your context. Is it true for you or false for you, or yes or no kind of statement, does it apply to you or not. So, some question could be dichotomous format, self report questions. Some self report assessment scales are Likert type scale. Likert type scale, when we say, they are basically certain scaling methods are used, which could be 5-point scale, 7-point scale, 10-point scales, whatever it is. So, these are like certain scaling methods are used to understand the degree of mental judgments in a more refined way. So, this Likert type scaling might ask participant to rate the diverse aspects, rate about the agreement about certain statements. So, it may ask certain statement and ask the participant to what extent you agree with this statement. To what extent you agree could be in a scaling format, it could be used. So, it may include things like at one strength it is strongly disagree, to the other extreme strongly agree. So, strongly disagree to strongly agree, or somewhere in between there may be other kind of scaling things. So, this is how the degree of agreement could be measured in a Likert scale. Likerts could also use certain kinds of degrees of other aspects of the degrees of certain scaling method can be used, which may includes you agree very little or quite a bit or something like that. So, degrees could be measured in other ways also. Level of similarity of certain things about yourself, could also be used in the Likert type of scale. For example, you give a statement and say to what extent or this statement is very uncharacteristics of me or very characteristics of me. So, it is a kind of the similarity of this statement with yourself, you also measure using certain statement like this. This Likert scale could also use measure frequencies of some certain behaviors happening in one's life, which may include something happening never or always or in between that, in a 5 point or 7 point scale or something like that. So, this is another way of self report scale that are used using certain scaling methods of certain 5 point or 7 point scales or 10 point scales. There are other also possible formats used, like certain checklists are used. So, you can just tick on the checklist which applies to you. It can also include force choice scales, visual analog scales and so on, but these are less used. Most of the used scale formats are like dichotomous as well as more of a Likert scale are used. So, one of the major reason behind popularity of self report test is that these are very easy and inexpensive to administer and are often objective, but obviously their validity should be carefully evaluated. That is where a good test comes. So, in the name of self report, you cannot just use any kind of scale whatever comes to your mind, their validity has to be established. That is where we have discussed in the last lecture the importance of validity and reliability and so on. Because self report tests are very easy to make, one can make anything and say this is a test, So, it should not be like this, they should be properly designed and they should also go through proper the reliability and validity tests and so on. But when a good test is there, this is one of the easiest way to collect data and it is very inexpensive. You can collect large number of data from large number of people without really in a short span of time and so on. Some of the examples of existing self report tests which are highly reliable and valid, which are widely used across all cultures. One is called as MMPI, which basically means Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It is quite old test and it is still very popular and it is one of the widely used self report tests. So, it is one of the most comprehensive and popular self report test. It requires a respondent to address almost about 500 statements selecting true, false, cannot say kind of statements. Mostly they use this kind of scale of whether this statement is true for you or not, or you may also say I cannot say. So, this is very comprehensive scale. It was developed using mostly for people with certain psychological issues and disorders. So, this used a criterion related item selection, meaning that the chosen item aimed to distinguish between various groups of people, such as individuals with depression and those without. So, this scale is mostly can be used for people with psychological issues. So, it could distinguish people who are having depression and who are not having depression. So, mostly focusing on some of the aspects of psychopathology or mental illnesses. So, it is one of the most popular self report example of a self report test. So, this test was actually originally published in 1940s, quite old test by two clinical psychologists, Hathaway and neuropsychiatrist McKinley in the University of Minnesota. That is why it is called as Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And then many revisions of this test happened later on. One such revision happened in 1989, where it underwent a revision which became MMPI 2, which kind of sought to eliminate outdated terms and establish norms based on more representative sample of the United States and so on. So, it became much more updated based on the existing research findings and so on. Subsequently, another revision happened in 2008. So, it became MMPI 2 RF. RF basically means restructured form, which again kind of further revised based on the more modern researches and so on. Another self report test which is widely used and one of the most popular self report tests in the field of personality is NEO Personality Inventory. And NEO is a kind of acronym for 3 personality traits. One is neuroticism, then extroversion, and O is for openness. Personality inventory. So, they started with 3 kind of personality traits to measure personality traits, which later it measured 5 personality traits. So, basically this personality inventory was developed from a theory called as a big 5 factor model, which kind of one of the most popular or most kind of accepted theory of trait theory of personality, which we will be discussing in the upcoming lectures. So, this theory basically says there are 5 personality traits which are kind of universally applicable, and human beings can be distinguished using these 5 traits. So, it includes basically traits like conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism and openness. So, this particular inventory measured these 5 traits, and this is one of the most popular tests. So, this test again underwent many revisions. It also has a short form, long form and so on. So, this is also another examples of widely used self-report personality inventory, which is also highly reliable and valid. So, this is another one form of test which are directly self-report form of test. Another method of assessing personality which are less used, these are called as Q-sort tests, but which has its own advantages and kind of certain the different methodologies are used by this kind of test. So, this is called as a Q-sort test. So, Q-sort personality test presents an engaging and active alternative to traditional questionnaire based. So, if you look at this traditional questionnaire based, they have their many disadvantages also, advantages also, which we have already discussed earlier. Main advantage is that it is very easy, inexpensive, and disadvantage is that in many cases people may not accurately report their traits, simply because they will lie about themselves. It is also possible that sometimes people they don't intentionally lie, but they are not aware of themselves about certain aspects. People's awareness of themselves may vary. Some people are not that self-aware. They may not know a lot of nuanced aspect about themselves because of unconscious influences and so on. So, it has its own problems, and so Q-sort kind of test is kind of uses more kind of active involvement of the participant rather than just reporting. So, in that sense it has its own advantages. So, what happens in Q-sort personality test is it's more of active involvement is there. So, rather than simply answering a question, participants are provided with a set of card containing various personality traits and characteristics. These traits cover a wide range of behaviors, attitudes and attributes. So, other in case of self-report, certain sets questions are given and then need to report about it. In Q-sorts, they typically give lot of cards. Each card will have a statement of certain personality characteristics. So, they will give many such cards, and the participant or the particular sample or whoever is involved in the research, they are asked to sort these cards according to their own characteristics on different levels. So, it has its own methods to do that. So, they will kind of sort most significant characteristics to least significant characteristics. They need to sort these cards on different piles and so on. So, there is a more active involvement of the participant in this case rather than just reporting about certain questions. So, this Q-sort personality test represents a modern attempt to capture more objective behavioral data in the personality research. So, it is much more objective and much more kind of active involvement is required here. So, in that sense it is different from the typical questionnaire method. So, this particular method was first introduced by a physicist and psychologist. His name is William Stephenson. He developed Q methodology in 1930s. So, he developed something called as a Q methodology. Out of that, this whole assessment method came out. So, Stephenson's diverged from his colleagues. Most of the existing colleagues like Spearman, who gave factor analysis and other things, most of the existing approach of kind of personality assessment was different from what he was proposing. So, he disagreed with some of the existing colleagues who were measuring personality by questioning their variable centered methodology. If you see most of the self-report questionnaire method that are used, they are mostly variable oriented methodology. So, they kind of large number of people are given these questionnaires, and then in the population itself or a particular group of people, they seen what kind of traits are available and so on. And then they see which trait is more dominant, which trait is less dominant and so on. So, focus is more on variables like what kind of traits are there. So, he said this whole approach is variable oriented or what you are measuring as compared to less focus is given on the person himself or herself. Whereas, he said in the measurement of personality, person should be given more importance. From there, that is where he disagrees about the existing methodologies. So, he proposed a person centered system of data collection, scaling analysis, which contrasted with the existing approaches. So, this is how it is different Q methodology from the existing one. So, the existing one is called R methodology, which focuses on a group of people across large sample. They measure certain traits and they see the patterns. Typically, in the R methodology, correlation analytical techniques are used to explore patterns of relationship between variables, while factor analytical techniques are used kind of to understand variability among observed variables in terms of latent factors. So, basically the idea is correlations are then metrics are created, the relationship among all the factors or the personality traits that are measured, and then patterns are kind of seen which variables come together as a group using factor analysis techniques. So, these are statistical techniques that are used. We will not go into the details of those techniques, but the typical approach is like this. So, typically questionnaires and structured clinical interviews are developed based on this method, which aims to understand constructs systematically. So, most of this use questionnaire methods and other thing in the R methodology system. On the other hand, Q methodology is mostly different from this existing approach in the sense that its focus is it kinds of. So, he highlighted a contradiction in the variable centered approach. So, there is a problem in the variable centered approach according to the Stephenson, who developed Q methodology. He said this whole variable centered approach or R methodology aims to study individual differences, but uses methods that provide information about average traits in a population. So, you are looking at population or a group of people and the kind of patterns of trait on that. Whole focus is not on the understanding the individual himself or herself, which should be the focus in the personality assessment. So, this approach focuses on isolated aspects of person, ignoring the interdependence in forming a whole personality. So, that is what his argument is based on. So, Stephenson and his colleagues also suggested this correlation factor analyzing persons rather than variable. Rather than correlating or using statistic on the variables, use the person as a focus or unit of analysis. So, that is how it is different from the R methodology. So, which basically is called as a Q methodology. So, which then gave rise to the Q factor analysis or person factor analysis, which gives certain Q factors which are there within the person. So, you study a person holistically and certain factors are emerged statistically about that person, and obviously then you can measure other people and see the pattern itself, but the focus is more on understanding the person more, that is the focus of analysis is more on that. So, he said the existing methodologies that are used in the R method to collect data and so on will not be applicable here, because their focus is more on the variables. So, to address this issue, he developed something called as a Q-sort method to ensure that the holistic understanding of the person is given more importance. So, in this Q-sort method, basically it comprises a diverse set of items, as we have already said, mostly in the cards of different personality characteristics. So, it is a collection of personality traits where everybody can find something about themselves. So, this whole set of card is called as concords. This concords is the total population of items from which final Q-sort samples are drawn. So, there is a whole set of list from there for a particular, whenever you want to measure the particular person, a certain items or certain items are taken from that concords, a sample item, Q-sort sample. This item can be sourced from various forms of communication, including literature, interviews, focus groups. So, they could be taken from all kinds of sources, whatever is relevant. Once this is established, a suitable ranking system and sorting distribution must be chosen. which is mostly done by the person himself. So, he will sort these cards according to which is most characteristics of that person to least characteristics, and they make certain piles of those cards. Sometimes it is certain forced choice is given, sometimes free distribution is given. So, depending on different methodology, different researcher, different methods are also used. So, Stephenson used the term psychological significance to use this Q sort technique. So, participants are asked to rank items with high psychological significance, which are highly significant to them, those with low significance. So, the idea is they need to sort according to the significance of these items to themselves. Each item or stimulus is then ranked relative to others. Relative to these different statements, they are ranked one another. So, which is more significant is given more rank like this, and this captures the interdependence and complexity. So, if you see, this whole process is much more active involvement is required, much more dynamism is there, and people kind of have freedom to choose their own kind of structure of their own personality according to what they say, rather than just blindly reporting something that is already there. So, unlike questionnaire, as I said, which presents an already predetermined concept, here it allows participants to project their own viewpoints and meanings. So, in that sense it is much more significant. So, this method captures the unique perspective and psychological significance assigned by the participant, offering a more personalized comprehensive understanding. So, that is the advantage of the Q sort techniques, but obviously this takes much more time and involvement from the participant. And finally, the Q factor analysis is done to kind of find the patterns within the person as well as in terms of comparison with the other person. So, that is called as a Q factor analysis. Okay. So, this is more of a specific statistical thing that is done. Whatever data they get from this sorting techniques, then it is used for analyzing using Q factor analysis. Now, projective tests are another set of tests which are kind of used by many theorists to understand personality or assess personalities. Now, these tests are based completely on different ideas than what kind of objective test or self-report test that you have used. These tests are completely different from them in terms of the assumptions behind those tests. So, these are basically tools for assessing personality where individuals are believed to project their personal needs, fears, values into their interpretation or description of a stimulus that is ambiguous. So, the basic idea is, if you give an ambiguous stimuli where there is no clarity what is happening in that particular situation or a photo or a particular picture, if it is not very clear what is going on, then the people, when they are asked to describe about this particular ambiguous stimuli, they are more likely to, in the description, they are more likely to give flavors of their own personality. What kind of person they are, that description will reflect their personality. So, they will project their personalities, their inner conflicts and fears and needs on the interpretation. That is where they can capture what kind of person that is by using this kind of test. Rather than giving very structured question answer, here they will give a very ambiguous stimuli, which could be a photograph or which could be a certain ambiguous picture of something, and then they are asked to describe using certain specific criteria, and then the reports are recorded, and based on that personality assessments are done. These tests are mostly based on Sigmund Freud's theory of unconscious mind, which we will be talking later, which says that we all human beings have unconscious mind or mind that is not conscious, which you are not aware of. So many things are there within your mind, a certain part of mind which you are not aware of. So, the content of those unconscious mind influences your behavior in terms of so many aspects of your behavior. It may include things like slip of tongue, or it could be things like a lot of emotional expression and so on. So, people project those unconscious needs and fears when certain situations are there in the outside environment, particularly when given a kind of ambiguous stimuli. So, it is possible that we can understand those deeper needs and so on. So, these tests are based on the theory that when confronted with an ambiguous stimuli, individual will project their inner conflicts, needs, emotion into those stimuli, revealing their own personality which are hidden from their conscious awareness. Okay? So, directly if you ask, people may not be able to give a lot of accurate description about themselves, but when they are kind of describing an ambiguous stimuli, a lot of those unconscious aspect of their mind on their personality will be projected on those stimuli. So, that is why they are called as a projective tests. So, typically in this kind of test, the person is asked to respond to a stimuli such as an image or an ink blot or an incomplete sentences, and the responses are then interpreted based on certain criteria or trained people and so on. Okay. Two most well known projective tests are Rorschach ink blot test. So, the basically this test is a certain ambiguous ink blots. Rorschach was the person who developed this test. So, this is called as a Rorschach ink blot test. Another is called as the thematic apperception test, TAT. Both are one of the kind of very popular projective tests. Let us see what are these kind of tests is all about. So, mostly interpretation of these tests are very subjective, and it requires the different systems are there to interpret the results. So, that is why probably the reliability and validity of these tests are questionable. We will look into that part later. So, certain limitations are there, but they are used in different contexts also. So, let us start with this Rorschach ink blot test. So, this is the person Hermann Rorschach who developed this test. So, this was developed in 1921 by this Swiss psychiatrist. His name is Hermann Rorschach. He had a lifelong fascination with ink blots, dating back to his childhood. So, somehow he was very interested in ink blots. So, whenever you put an ink on a paper, it takes different shapes based on So, somehow he was very much interested in those ink blots from his childhood, and it continued throughout his adulthood also. So, as a teenager, Rorschach acquired this nickname Klex, meaning blot of inks. So, people kind of used to use him with this name because of his fascination with the ink blots due to his intense interest in ink blots. So, during his psychiatric training or residency practices, he observed consistently the differences in the response ink blots between patients and school children, which inspire him to develop a test. So, he found those ink blots when they are shown to different peoples, including patients and school children, everybody gives different version of their stories. So, he found this could kind of differentiate individuals based on characteristics. So, he developed more formal test based on those ideas. So, he created ink blots himself by dropping ink on paper and then folding this paper into half. So, if you take a paper like this, so probably it's a paper, he will put an ink blot here and then he will kind of fold it like this, and it will take certain shapes and ambiguous shape, it will not have any fixed structure, and this is how he developed almost setting 10 distinct patterns he found, which were kind of more, according to him, more reliably can be used. So, and then people were asked to basically when given these ink blots, and they are asked to describe what is happening in that particular picture, and based on that he kind of used to analyze their personalities and so on. Despite his initial publication failure, and a lot of negative reviews were given initially because it is very unstructured, Rorschach ink blot test gained immense popularity later on after his death. In fact, because of his negative criticism, he himself became depressed and and also died after some time, but his kind of test became much more popular after his death and so on later on. How it is administered? So, this ink blot test involves presenting these cards with ink blot structure, ambiguous figures and so on. We will see how these figures are one at a time with some black and white and others in color. Test takers are asked to describe what they see on the each card. So, these cards are somehow like this. So, if you see, these are all ink blot test, this is how very ambiguous figure, there is no fixed structure. So, such cards one by one they are given to the participants, and they are asked to describe what they see in that, and and basically people there are psychologists use different criteria to analyze. For example, a well formed response that aligns with the ink blot structure, more structured response suggests a good psychological functioning of that person, more realistic in orientation, while poorly formed responses indicate unrealistic fantasies and bizarre behavior. So, for example, this is one thing that is used to interpret the personality of the person. Content of the response, such as whether subjects see animate or inanimate objects, based on their certain types of assessments are done. Somebody may say a kind of animate objects, or inanimate object also could be seen by some people. Some people may see humans in the figure, some people say animals also, and expressions of affections and hostility could also be expressed in those figures. All these are interpreted kind of using certain criteria and so on to judge that person or kind of assess that person. For example, more specifically, if repeated perceptions of fighting animals somebody could see versus cooperative humans would lead to different interpretation of that person, what kind of things that see or project themselves in those figures. Content can be symbolic. Some people also say symbolic contents, like an explosion may be symbolized as intense hostility. Somebody may see a pig, which may indicate things like gluttonous nature, and a fox may suggest a craftiness and aggression. For example, these are some of the examples how it is interpreted. Negative images like spiders and octopuses might represent a dominating mother, while gorillas or giants could indicate negative attitude towards a dominating father. Ostrich might symbolize certain conflicts to hide oneself and so on. So, like this, these are some of the interpretations which are given to, which are kind of understood as a projection of the personality of the person. So, all these responses are hypothesized to be an individual's reflection of personality, which are checked against other responses. It is not like just one response, based on that one response somebody will judge or assess a personality. Different responses are collectively looked at, certain patterns are observed. The examiner also observes an unusual behavior for further interpretation. Somebody may show certain sometimes unusual behaviors, like a subject who frequently asks for guidance may be seen as a dependent kind of person, while one who seems tense, subtly questions and looks at the back of the card may be interpreted as a suspicious or paranoid kind of person. Like that, some additional behavioral observations are also done in this kind of test. Now, certain attempts have been made to standardize this scoring system, but you can understand this kind of, it is a very ambiguous and subjective test. It is very difficult to make it very standardized system. Still, some researchers tried to develop certain comprehensive system. One such was like developed by Exner in 1993 to attempt to kind of improve the reliability and validity of such tests. However, generally lot of controversies and debates are there around this kind of test, particularly because people always question the validity of such test, because it is too subjective. Different people will interpret the same response differently. So, agreement is very less on this kind of test. We will see more about this validity and so on. Still, they are very popular, they are used in addition to many other tests, but the validities are always questioned. The next one is thematic apperception test, which is also in short form as TAT. It was developed by Henry Murray and his colleague Christian Morgan in 1935. This is another projective test. It comprises about 19 ambiguous pictures, each depicting one or more person along with a blank card, one blank card. So, here the process is little different. Again, it is projective test, but here pictures of people are given in a card which are very ambiguous, and you can develop a story around these pictures. When you project again your own story version on these ambiguous pictures, then it is more of a reflection of your own personality. So, that is the idea behind this test. So, these pictures are deliberately made vague about events portrayed and can be interpreted in various ways. Okay? So, this projective tests are always stimuli are very vague. You can have different kinds of responses to them. Different people will respond to them very differently, which is an indication of the personality of that person. So, that is the idea behind it. So, this kind of cards are given where there will be a picture, ambiguous picture. You can have multiple interpretation of this kind of pictures. and you are asked to make a story or what is happening in that particular picture when people are asked to respond to that. So, this could be, this is another one card, for example, this is another card which shows an again and people in a picture is very ambiguous, people can have multiple interpretation to that. So, like this kind of cards are given which are quite ambiguous. So, individual are generally, the idea is project their personality into this stimulus and they interpret it, revealing their own characteristics through the stories they tell through these pictures. So, Murray in 1938 highlighted when interpreting an ambiguous social situation, a person is likely to express their own personality as much as the phenomena they are describing. So, the idea behind projective test is this only. So, typically people are generally unaware of lot of things, lot of details about themselves, but while weaving a story about pictures, this allows them to express or remove their defenses about themselves and project their personality on the story itself. So, generally in the TAT is administered where individual is asked to create a story about the people and the objects depicted in each picture. Some of the picture I have already shown. So, they are asked to create a story around this picture. So, they are prompted to describe what led up to the situation, the thoughts and emotions of the individual involved and the outcome of the scenario, what is going to happen in that scenario. So, like this some prompts are also additionally given to create the story. So, this TAT has been utilized not only in clinical settings, but also in the experimental research, particularly in the study of human motivation, to understand the motivation of human beings. One particular researcher named David McClelland, he used these TAT cards to understand human motivation, particularly the motivation, particularly motive to achieve something, and he found this test could be very useful in terms of understanding human motivation, particularly motive to achieve in the life, whatever they want to achieve. So, this test could reflect motivation also apart from just personality traits and so on, mostly the underlying motivations, deeper motivations of human beings. Again, the interpretation of response, some structured few things are there. TAT responses are scored systematically according to the scheme developed by Murray and his colleagues on certain, or sometimes people use just impressionistic basis of interpretation. In clinical setting, psychologists analyze TAT responses considering various factors like personal relationship depicted, character motivations and level of contact with the reality as described in the story and so on. So, all this information could be depicted from kind of understood from the TAT tests and so on. Now, another projective test which are also very, these are not that popular, but people sometimes use them also. These are like very small kinds of tests. These are called, one is called as an word association test. So, in the word association test, the personality assessment is originally, it was originally developed by Francis Galton in the late 19th century. However, Carl Jung, who is one of the most prominent psychologist, he significantly expanded and popularized the use of this word association test in psychology, particularly exploring unconscious mind and diagnosis psychological complexes of the people. So, in the word association test, individuals are presented with the list of words one at a time and asked to respond to each with the first word that comes to mind. So, a word is asked, given to the person and asked to respond as soon as possible whatever comes to their mind when they look at this word or hear this word, anything that comes to their mind without any thinking about it. So, anything, so a word is given and they are asked to respond to this word as quickly as possible, whatever comes to their mind when they hear about this word. So, this is again the idea is very simple to similar to other projective test. When people comes out with this kind of associations of words, a lot of their unconscious ideas comes into the picture. So, standard association tests involve timing quick responses to trigger words. Most of the earlier researchers like Galton and others, they use this test for understanding cognitive fitness, how quickly one can come with. So, their idea was very different. However, Jung developed kinds of use this test for further understanding of personality of the person. For example, he innovated concentrating on what kind of mistake people make while responding to these word associations, what delays, how much delay they make, how much distorted answer they come. All these also kinds of are reflective of the personality of the person. So, Jung used this kind of other aspects to understand the personality. So, basically Jung used this test to understand the human unconscious aspect of the mind also. Another test that is also used in the as a projective test is sentence completion test. Again, it is also very similar to the idea here. Some vague ambiguous sentences will be given, and then you need to fill the some part of the sentence will be given and you need to fill the other part. For example, my ambition is dash dash dash, what worries me is dash dash dash, whatever, some kind of where everybody can give their own answers. So, again by this sentence completion test, the idea is the person's characteristics comes into the picture. One can kind of analyze the personality. Responses to these prompts offer insight about individual thoughts, feelings and concerns. Interpretation of this response is again completion like other projective tests. This could be very subjective also, but people can kind of look at some of the aspects of the personality through this test. Now, the main question is, are these tests valid tests? A lot of controversies and debates have already happened around these tests, whether they are valid or not. The projective tests have been extensively used by various psychologists, including clinical psychologists over last 50 years, and these tests have been administered to millions of people. Okay. So, these tests are very used a lot of frequently, but again their validity have always been questioned. The key question is that whether these tests are effective at predicting important life outcomes, which is connected to whether they are valid or not. Now, this question is not easy to answer because it is complexities around this question is because of diverse things that are involved in the test. Few things are like variable predicting validity. The projective test might be effective at predicting something and may not be effective at predicting something else. So, that is why straightforward yes no answer is not cannot be given in this context. So, these tests have been found to be good at predicting few things and not good at predicting other things. So, thus it may not be possible to give a straightforward answer. Their validity may depend on the specific outcomes being studied. Also, there are different scoring systems are developed and people use different scoring system. Which scoring system is used, their validity also depends on that. So, because of different scoring system used to analyze the data, their validity is also changes from one scoring system to another scoring system. Now, in that context, just to understand the validity of it, one of the most comprehensive study was done by this one, Lilienfeld and colleagues in 2000. They conducted an extensive reviews of various projective tests that are used in the research and clinical setting, including Rorschach test and thematic apperception test and their scoring methods. Their finding shows nuanced picture of the validity of such tests. Now, some of the positive findings that they found is that some scoring methods are valid for specific purposes. For instance, scoring TAT stories for themes related to achievement motivation as proposed by Devin McClelland has shown that the TAT responses can be correlated with measures of motivated behavior. So, in this particular aspects motivation or particularly achievement motivation context, TAT tests have been found to be reliably predict the certain life outcomes. So, in that particular context they have been found to be reliable or valid. Additionally, TAT motive measures have been found to predict how well individuals remember daily events related to their motivation. So, basically some motivational aspects TAT tests have been found to be valid and reliably predicts life outcomes. But there is a general limitation that have been observed in this review study is that despite some of these positive results, review indicated that projective tests are generally do not perform well in predicting outcomes. Most of the other outcomes generally most of these projective tests have not found to be very strongly predictive outcomes and strong validity has been questioned. For example, various scoring methods for the Rorschach test did not consistently relate to relevant outcomes, suggesting the choices of scoring system has minimal impact. irrespective of different scoring system developed, most of the scoring system could not predict very strongly the different outcomes studied by this test in terms of personality traits and so on. Similarly, while some scoring methods of TAT achievement themes showed validity, most other TAT scoring system like Rorschach test also lacked consistent validity. Sometimes they predicted, sometimes they did not, and so on. So, that consistency was missing. Most of these negative conclusions about the validity of this test align with some other independent studies by scholars who also critically examined this research and test, and they found that generally they perform poorly in the clinical use and so on. Because of this limitation, even some bodies like American Psychological Association also agreed that projective tests should not be included in modern psychological training. They should not be made a kind of very formal kind of testing system for personality and so on. But despite that, they are very popularly used, still used by in different settings, and some people use them more than others because they can be helpful in certain aspects, understanding few things when they are used with other additional assessment tests and so on. So, these are called projective tests. This is about projective tests. The next is clinical interviews and behavioral assessment. Another way of assessing personality is that formal clinical interviews are done, mostly used for identifying especially personality aspect of the patients of certain psychological disorders and so on. So, here assessment includes interviews basically. So, face to face interviews are done with the person. One can obtain valuable information by talking to the person rather than asking very specific questions and responding to the scales and so on. In detail, you ask face to face about different aspect of the person, and this is how clinical interviews are done. Then person is evaluated on relevant questions about past, present life experiences, social, family relationship, problems that they face, they are seeking for psychological help and so on. Whatever the objective of the interview is that they will ask those relevant questions and they will try to find detailed answer from the person himself rather than very specific questions as in self-report questionnaires. So, this allows much more deeper exploration of the behaviors, emotions, thoughts of the person. In the clinical interviews, behavioral assessment are also done in terms of by observing their body postures, how they respond and so on. That also reflects a lot of things about the person. So, behavioral assessment are generally associated with clinical interviews also. So, basically a lot of these findings of structured self-report like MMPI, people also, in order to get more specific insight, they could conduct clinical interviews to target specific issues and understand more about them. So, they mostly these tests are in combination they are used. So, interpretation of interview data is again subjective, and but it is more in terms of because you are asking very specific question and answer will give more specific information about it, even though they are more subjective, but they are not as subjective as projective test. So, and may be influenced by interviewer's theoretical perspective and personal character. Obviously, it may be influenced by the person who is interviewing. So, that is something is given, and mostly a lot of these clinical interviews are associated with other kind of tests like self-report test also. Behavioral assessment, as I said, is many times it is with interviews it is kind of additionally used to evaluate person's actions while talking and so on, or even observing actions in the real life. Accuracies of this kind of enhances with the familiarity and frequency of interaction. The more you know about the person, better you can judge from the behaviors. The frequency also of interaction as increases, more accurate behavioral assessment can be done. So, similarly in the clinical interviews, counselors also regularly observes clients' behaviors about the body language, facial expression, nervous gesture, overall appearance and so on. All this also gives a lot of information about the person. The last one is biological measures. Personality test not very frequently used by personality psychologists, biological measures, because these are more expensive, more specific training is required, more understanding is required, but still a lot of people also use biological measures to understand personality. Let us see some of the biological tests that are used to understand human personalities. One is neuroimaging techniques. which basically takes map of the human brain itself using things like MRI, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and positron emission tomography, which is also called as PET scans, which are typically used by neurosurgeons also in the hospitals and so on. So, the idea is using these techniques you can map the structure of the brain or what is happening in the brain, you can kind of see the functioning aspect also. So, that is why neurosurgeons finds defects or problems in the brain functioning, and accordingly these are the kind of tests used. So, by analyzing brain's regions activations in response to various stimuli or tasks, researcher can infer individuals' tendencies towards traits such as impulsivity, empathy, and risk taking. Certain brain areas functioning are associated with this kind of personality. People who are impulsive, who are or maybe risk taking, or somebody is high empathy. So, certain brain areas are associated with this functioning. Using this neuroimaging technique, one can understand, identify those brain areas, or at least you can make certain conclusions based on that. So, fMRI PETs can provide detailed images of the brain activity in response to various stimuli and tasks. So, when you give certain people to ask certain questions or give some stimuli, the brain start functioning, and this imaging technique can give you the detail what is going on in the brain itself, and from there we can understand certain aspect of the person also. Some brain activities can be correlated with certain specific personality traits such as extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness. All these traits we will be talking more in detail in the upcoming trait theories and so on. So, idea is that certain personality traits can be linked to certain brain as part of the brain functioning. For example, increased activity in brain regions associated with reward processing, this is a part of the brain name, may be linked to extroversion, while heightened activity in certain regions of threat detection like amygdala is a part of brain region, part of brain associated with neuroticism or more anxiety or nervous kind of behavior is associated with certain activation of hyperactivation of certain brain like amygdala. If it is too active, then the person is mostly very nervous and mostly lot of this neuroticism trait is there. More worries, more tension, more emotional instability is more likely to happen. So, like that certain brain functions may be connected to certain traits. In the biological assessment also people use genetic markers sometimes. So, in the genetic studies people identify specific genes or segment or genetic variations associated with certain personality traits. So, examining a specific genetic makeup of an individuals using certain techniques like genotyping or genome sequencing, which are highly expensive and specifically very few researcher does this kind of things. Researcher can identify genetic markers linked to certain traits, which certain genetics genes could be responsible for certain kind of behavioral expression, including personality traits. So, genetic studies have identified candidates genes associated with personality traits, including genes involving neurotransmitter functioning like serotonin transporter gene and neural development, like these are specific certain genes have already been identified and so on related to certain personality traits. By examining these genes through genetic testing, researcher can assess individual genetic predispositions. Sometimes people are more, genes may not directly cause certain behavior, but they may make you more vulnerable if certain genes are present in that person. However, the problem with genetic marker research is that no single gene has been generally found for particular things. Mostly personality traits are polygenic. So, many genes are associated with expression of one particular trait. So, it is generally people have not found one specific gene for one particular trait and so on. Many genes are responsible for one functions and so on. So, because of this aspect, many times this genetic marker is not easy and not very clearly defining finding about any specific genes related to personality traits and so on. People also do neurochemical analysis to understand personality, which includes understanding neurotransmitters and hormones also play a significant role in human behavior, mood and emotions, and understanding their functions also could also reflect human personality. Analyzing level of certain neurotransmitter like dopamine, serotonin, or hormones like cortisol, oxytocin through blood test and saliva samples can provide insight into individuals' emotional regulation, social behavior and stress response. For example, cortisol is directly related to stress response. When people are highly stressed, cortisol is released in large amount in the blood, and they bring about lot of changes in the body. So, they will reflect certain characteristics. Dopamine, serotonin has also been linked to depression and other anxiety disorders and so on. So, they change moods and patterns of the behavior, also certain neurotransmitters and hormones and so on. For instance, low serotonin level have been associated with impulsivity and aggression. When people have low serotonin level in their body, then it leads to more impulsive actions, more aggressive kind of actions, while higher level of cortisol is linked to chronic stress and anxiety. People who are highly stressed and anxiety level is very high generally, one of the reason is the cortisol level in the blood is very high. So, that could also influence your mood and behavior. Psychophysiological measures are also used in analyzing certain personality aspects. Psychophysiological measures like heart rate variability, skin conductance, pupil dilation, these all reflects the functioning of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, which is not in our control. So, nervous system, a lot of we can move body and other things because these are in our control. Lot of functioning of the nervous system, which are autonomic nervous system, which controls lot of functions, are not in our control. Like heartbeat, we cannot control it. Pupil dilation, skin conductance, resistance levels and so on, these are automatically controlled by autonomic nervous system activity, and their activity reflects lot of our characteristics, because they also influence your moods and emotions and thought processes. So, this measure also can provide real time assessment of emotional arousal, attentional processes and stress reactivity. For example, increased skin conductance in response to aversive stimuli may indicate heightened emotional arousal, while changes in pupil dilation may reflect shift in cognitive processing. So, a lot of mental and emotional functions could be associated with lot of these functions, lot of these physiological parameters, which are measured using psychophysiological measures. EEG, ERP analysis, these are also again part of this is how EEG measures brain electric activity. ERP measures neural response to certain stimuli. So, when certain, let us say somebody is reading something and then what happens in the brain. So, in response to a stimuli, ERP test measures response of the neural stimuli when certain of the brain when certain stimuli are given. So, these are again also used to reflect certain understanding of the human personalities. So, these are also linked to studies have linked EEG and ERP parameters. So, I will not go into all these technical aspects of it. To certain personalities like extroversion, neuroticism and impulsivity, certain parameters of these measures are also connected to personality aspects. For instance, greater left frontal EEG activity has been associated with positive affect, means positive emotions and approach motivation, whereas greater right frontal activity, right frontal means it is a part of the brain. So, this is the frontal part, this is left and this is the right. Based on which one is more active, certain emotions, certain characteristics will be reflected in your behavior. So, right frontal activity has been linked to negative affect and withdrawal tendencies and so on. So, this could be measured using EEG and ERP analysis. So, these are some of the measures that are used for the assessment of personality, specific methods. So, with this I kind of stop here in terms of personality assessment. We will talk about other aspects, more specific theories of personality in the upcoming lectures. Thank you.